Frank Gaffney is with me, Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Securing America with Frank Gaffney is his show. Frank, throw us that website again. I know you've got the one-stop shop now. Where are we going?
SecuringAmerica.tv, Alex.
Okay, easy enough. Okay, well, great to have you back. Let's talk a little bit about what Biden's up to. I always was skeptical of the narrative Biden's not really the president, Kamala Harris is really the president, and Biden, look at him, oh boy, he's old and he's slow, so he can't get anything done. Well, he's getting a lot done, and he's doing stuff very quickly because he knows how to operate the levers in Washington, and he's doing a lot of bad stuff. He's on a rapid pace to undo a lot of the good President Trump did on foreign policy, particularly with China and the Middle East. Let's start with China. What's Biden up to when it comes to China at the moment?
Well, let me just say, Alex, if I can, before we turn to that, the readouts of Kamala Harris taking calls or making calls to these heads of state may be a tell that Biden is being gradually sidelined. But
Frank, they'd say, but vice presidents call world leaders all the time. Frank, if it was President Frank and Vice President Alex, I know you'd be worrying about big stuff, and I'd probably be working the phones. It'd probably be how it would go. So I don't know.
I'm not so sure, Alex.
You'd want to do all the calls
for the administration. I wouldn't let you call anybody. No, that's for
sure. Wow, I'm so
anyway,
insulted.
The point is that under Biden's administration, Biden-Harris administration, however you want to characterize it, we are seeing major steps taken to try to appease or otherwise accommodate China in ways that I think are going to be very problematic, both in their own right, Alex, and we can go through a number of them if you'd like, but in their own right, but also in terms of the signals that are being unmistakably sent to the Chinese. And you've done some good reporting at Breitbart on this effort by Congressman Jim Banks, the chairman of the House Republican Study Committee, that goes through some of those concessions that have been made right up front, unconditionally, and with material consequences, I think, as well as the personnel that are being appointed throughout this administration that the Chinese would call old friends. And that's a very ominous thing indeed, because these old friends have track records going back in some cases to the Obama administration, in some cases to their work in the private sector after they left the Obama administration. And certainly in terms of what they have been saying, even in office now, we're seeing, I think, encouragement given to the Chinese Communist Party that it will have its way with the United States in the future. And as I say, that's going to be a very big problem, not just for us, but I think for the world.
The other thing that I think is pretty interesting here and somewhat disturbing is that Biden seems to take Xi Jinping at his word in a lot of cases and saying, I think he said yesterday the line about how Xi Jinping gets it. I forget the exact context. I just caught that while I was kind of scanning some of the clips from last night at the CNN town hall that he did. And it's very interesting because there's a big divide in the United States between people who understand every single utterance connected to China is propaganda, and those who actually think China is really just like, America in the East. I mean, they're just like us. They have the same values. They're pursuing the same goals. They have the same way of getting there. And maybe there are some little quirks because of cultural differences. But for the most part, we're just friendly rivals. I think this is a big fundamental divide right now. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, look, there's a special problem here, as you know, because Joe Biden, when he was the number two in the United States government, and Xi Jinping was the number two in the Chinese government, used to hang together. In fact, there's a really kind of bizarre moment in the midst of his swearing in of government officials on his, I think, first day in office, where he just took a sort of 10-minute trip down memory lane and almost romantically described the time he spent with Xi Jinping on the Tibetan plateau, and they were, bonding together. And So if he thinks that Xi gets it, I think Xi knows that he's got Joe. And, there's this, talk about these calls, there's a 2-hour call between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. Kamala didn't take that one. Joe took that one.
Yeah.
And the question occurs, even if you, ascribe some of it to just translation time, that's an awful long time. And the only thing that occurs to me is it took that long because Joe was taking orders from Xi Jinping about what he was to do. And there's a very long agenda, in particular because Xi Jinping has to make sure that Biden et al. Completely undo all of the things that Donald Trump did that the Chinese didn't get, they didn't like, they resented, they found really problematic in a lot of respects. And that's, unfortunately, as this Republican Study Committee report signals, is a process that's well underway.
I was wondering the same thing. I had the same thought. What could they possibly be getting after for 2 hours? I don't. How much could you go through? We know Joe he does this stuff where he just says stuff and he just keeps rambling, and he has this innate ability that a lot of politicians of a certain age and demo, Frank, I think have, where they can just sort of say a lot without actually articulating anything. I'm sure there was a bit of that going on, but 2 hours, that's a lot. Because you would think it would be the most intense conversation of his month or his quarter. Is he really wanted to take that long? It doesn't need to. I'm sure you can get a lot done in 15 minutes. Well,
it's especially troubling because the readout, as they call it, not to be confused with the release of a transcript.
Sure.
Which, I'm not in favor of as a general rule, but in this case, I think the public actually has a need to know. But in this case, the readout from the White House was very thin gruel. It was basically, they talked about, China's unfair economic practices and, how it's treating Hong Kong and its other human rights issues and aggressiveness towards Taiwan. Well, yeah, I would like to think that he talked about all of those things, Alex, and in some detail, and actually pressed, an America First agenda in the course of the call. But I don't think that's what happened.
I don't either, and that's unfortunate. The World Health Organization is defending China from accusations that they're hiding coronavirus data. China is, I'm sure, hiding data. I'm sure that they've destroyed evidence. They're basically accusing the coronavirus or accusing the United States as being the origin of the coronavirus, which is false. And the World Health Organization are their toadies to such an insane degree. And I just wonder if there's anywhere else on Earth who doesn't see through it the way, right-wing America sees through it. Are we alone, Frank, or do others see the BS that the World Health Organization is putting out there?
Alex, I think that, large numbers of countries, both populations probably to the extent that they're clued up, but certainly governments, are under no illusion now that the World Health Organization, like an awful lot of other international organizations, by the way, have been effectively, if not literally, taken over by the Chinese Communist Party. They have put their own people in charge of them, and they run them as essentially vehicles for advancing China's agenda. And never mind that, these are supposed to be multinational bodies and under the UN's auspices and so on. That's not how it works, because the Chinese play the game very well, and they essentially expropriate these organizations. And by the way, people like this Peter Daszak, a so-called UK zoologist who has been a consultant to or involved in the WHO processes for years. He's been, essentially a running dog, as they call them, of China. And so when he's running interference for them, when some of the people, even some of the people in the WHO's own inspection team, come out and say, hey, they stiffed us. They didn't give us access. They didn't give us the data. They withheld information. Daszak and this gal Thea Fisher is a Danish epidemiologist. If you as you all have been reporting, were trotted out to say, oh, no, everything was great. They were so cooperative. This is a testament to the unreliability of this international organization, but it fits the larger pattern. And we ought to be seeing nations around the world, including those that are paying the bills. And we're going to be back in that business with the World Health Organization, thanks to Joe Biden, holding these guys accountable. And we're not doing it.
What would be the logic of volunteering our money for the World Health Organization right now when we see the deficit, we see the debt, we see how many Americans are unemployed or underemployed? How many of us are underinsured at this point, thanks to the genius of Obamacare? Don't we have other things we should be spending our money on right now? Why does the World Health Organization need our cash?
Alex, it's about engagement. You can't lead from behind if you're not engaged with these guys, essentially on their terms. So, as I said, he announced, Joe Biden, when he went to the State Department 2 weeks ago, America is back. That was the money quote. That was the thing that was promoted everywhere. Back to what? As we talked about, I think at the time,
right.
Back to the Obama policies that have failed virtually without exception. And one of them is this idea that you can subordinate America, not America first. You can subordinate it, not America last, certainly America just another country, but only by virtue of being the sucker who goes into these international organizations and does what you're told by the Chinese who tend to dominate them and pays the bill to boot.
It is Frank, I should have written down that quote that you can't lead from behind unless what was that again?
Unless you're engaged.
Unless you're engaged. So good. It's very smart, very witty, Frank. Okay, let's move to the Middle East. There was one story where I guess we're getting so jaded at Breitbart that we almost ended up laughing at it, which is that there was an accidental blast during a bomb-making class that killed 30 Taliban fighters. Did you catch this one? It's a rare one where there's not a lot of Taliban humor in my life, but this was a rare moment of one.
I don't think they thought it was funny, but it's poetic, isn't it? And here's the good news, Alex, is that's the group that is supposed to be laying down arms and giving up the fight and accepting the idea that there's going to be this sort of new Afghanistan in which they're participating in the political process and so on. These are murderous Sharia supremacists. It's a good day when they kill themselves and not kill other people. They're, of course, big on doing the killing of other people by killing themselves, but it doesn't happen often enough. And in the absence of that, it seems to me, if we don't want them to be killing us, we best remain capable of putting them out of business. And I was very concerned, and I get that probably most of the people in your audience are sick to the teeth of Afghanistan, as am I. And I do worry that where we are now is a Taliban that is clearly determined to return to power and poised to do it, and will reinstitute fully the Sharia supremacist agenda there, and is going to continue to do business with, even though they have their rivalries, Al-Qaeda, which got us into this fix in the first place, operating from Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, as you recall, in 9/11, and, by the way, the Islamic State, and who knows how many other jihadist groups, including many of them from Pakistan, that are quite happy once again to get back into the business of killing infidels around the world, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world, from safe haven in Afghanistan if they can.
It's such an interesting, and the Middle East has always been like this, Frank, is that you're always choosing between the worst of possible options, but maybe we can pray that they just end up just keep blowing themselves up if they're jihadists, and that would just make everyone's life much easier. I would love to be the one who relays that to the rest of the town, that there was a giant bombing and who was responsible for it. It wasn't the Americans, it wasn't even someone in Europe. It was wasn't rival jihadis. No, it was we'd blown ourselves up. I just, to be a fly on the wall.
A lot of Afghans would celebrate that. Let me just say,
I'm sure, just to be a fly on the wall. Look, I think that's enough Taliban humor for one day. Let's move to a militia with suspected Iran ties, taking credit for Iraqi Kurdistan bombing and the injury of U.S. soldiers. This is a thing where I was a little disappointed in President Trump because it seemed like when he came in, he understood that the Kurds were worth defending and standing up for, and he really didn't do much. That ball got dropped. Why did that ball get dropped, and is this related to what happened here in this story?
Oh gosh, there's a lot of history here, Alex. Needless to say, the Kurds have been in a very difficult part of the world, relatively stalwart friends of this country.
Correct.
And I think you're right that we have, dropped the ball is one way of putting it, abandoned them on occasion, including under the Trump years, notably the Kurds in Syria, and to some extent in Iraq. They're enemies of Iran. I mean, they're Kurds in Iran, and they don't like that much. But they really don't like the idea that Kurds outside of Iran might be getting together to try to, create some kind of national homeland for people who don't have one. This is one of the last great populations, arguably, that doesn't have one. And the Turks feel the same way, by the way, as do the Syrians, more or less. And so you have a lot of friction points. But in this case, I think in the absence of American engagement and support, the Iranians have seen opportunities, in this case through proxies, but sometimes on their own, to launch rockets or missiles or otherwise to try to kill people in Erbil, the capital of this sort of Kurdish rump state, if you will. And sometimes they get Americans in the process. Sometimes they get contractors. Sometimes they get, just the native Kurds. But it's part of the ongoing struggle of Iran to dominate not only, its own people, of course, but also the people of Iraq, including those in this Kurdish area, and in Syria, and if they can, to use all of that as launching pads for attacks against Israel, which is their next main target, presumably, though I think we're in their crosshairs as well, which makes,
without a doubt,
again, what the Biden team is doing to try to, restore the Obama relationship with a hegemonic Iran just absolutely insane.
And this is the overarching theme for a lot of this stuff. It just seems like Biden is making some decisions simply because he wants to do the opposite of what Trump did. And that's just so – if that's what happens, we are going to really backslide. And it's so immature. But I do think that the Democrats are a very immature party at the moment. And I think that is they will make bad decisions simply to try to prove that Trump got something wrong. And that's disturbing. And we'll come back to it. But I was thinking about this in the context of one of my favorite issues, Frank, which is, and it's also one of my least favorite issues, tech censorship and how Ayatollah Khamenei is still on Twitter, but Donald Trump isn't. And so Donald Trump says, fight like hell or whatever to people who are marching on the Capitol, and he gets thrown off of Twitter. But Ayatollah Khamenei is responsible for, massive state funding of terror, and he can tweet at will. And it's just another remarkable thing about what's happening in our American culture, how we are losing track of what are the true evils around the world. And instead, we're trying to spend all of our time focused on Trump and his followers.
Yeah. Well, the great late Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick had a term for the kind of attitude that we're seeing. She called it the San Francisco Democrats. And, a lot of these big tech guys are San Francisco Democrats, Palo Alto, if you will, Silicon Valley Democrats. But they're Democrats, and they're, as Gene used to say, blame America first kind of folks oriented towards reflexively criticizing their own country and equally reflexively lionizing, holding up, promoting, supporting, and increasingly now enabling its enemies. And whether it's Iran or even much worse, China, to some extent, I guess the Russians, but particularly those two, you see the big tech operations, as you say, using their capacity to censor, cancel, negate, or simply obstruct people who feel differently about America, and to relentlessly assure the continued access to the public square of people whose single-minded purpose is, well, to use the Iranian phrase, death to America.
Absolutely.
It's obscene.
It is obscene, and this is where the fact that so much of the country is so bubbled and they either don't want to focus on these issues at all or only get one perspective on them. It's why it's so dangerous. And I don't even need them to agree with you and me on everything, Frank. It's just if people don't discuss some of this stuff, we're going to go to a very dark place, because I'll tell you who's thinking about it. Xi Jinping's thinking about it. Ayatollah Khamenei's thinking about it. These people are thinking about how to beat the United States of America. And we're sitting around thinking about what? Nothing? How to beat Trump? I mean, it's just, it's so exasperating. Sure.
Whatever it is, agenda is, I think, something they'd very much like to have us focused on, or our systemic racism, or, defunding the police or the military, or any number of other things that, of course, not only are divisive in our country,
right,
but are also conducing to a wild distraction from what they're actually doing. Alex, listen, if it were just that they're thinking about how to take down America, it would be one thing. The Chinese, as Banks and company are pointing out, are all about it and moving aggressively to execute their strategy with unrestricted warfare across the broadest imaginable front.
Exactly. And this is we need to be very, very conscious of this, or because we're going to get lapped. And if it's just so disturbing. Let me ask you about one more national security issue. Israel suggesting that it might ignore Joe Biden on Iran because Biden is not talking to Netanyahu for whatever reason. Do we have any insight into why Biden's not talking to Netanyahu and they've worked together in the past. Netanyahu's been prime minister a long time, going back to the Obama years. So why not? Why aren't they talking?
Well, there are lots of things to say about that quickly. One is that I believe the Biden-Harris administration hasn't gotten around, either of them, to calling Bibi Netanyahu just yet, because like the Obama administration before it, they actually have Democratic political operatives on the ground trying to defeat Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now once again in the midst of a re-election campaign, his fourth in 2 years, 3 years, I guess it is now. That's happening on the ground, and it would be a little counterproductive to be seen to be, trying to sort of have a good, cordial working relationship with him, which again was a Trump thing, so you can't do that because this is not Trump. But more to the point, it conflicts with their other agendas, as we've been talking about. They're reestablishing the hegemony, the dominant role in the Middle East of Iran. And so I don't, it sounds a little petty to say, well, Israel may go its own way because nobody's called Bibi. I don't think that's it. I think Israel feels it is going to have to go its own way because of the direction that the Biden-Harris administration is headed on Iran, that will ensure it does get the bomb and probably wields it more likely than not in the first instance against Israel if it can. That's a mortal threat that cannot be tolerated.
And I didn't mean it as dismissive. I think this audience is coached up.
The reporting, I think, on it it suggests that it's like tit for tat. It's not that at all.
No, it's Iran's ready to strike, and they want to every moment. If you're in Israel, you have to be worried about them, and that's they're correct to be utterly diligent and to be kind of the polar opposite of how we're behaving in the United States, in my opinion. Frank Gaffney, wonderful as always. We'll talk to you next week. SecuringAmerica.tv for all things Gaffney. Thanks, Frank.
Bless you. Thank you, Alex.
Take a quick break. Be right back.